What do you want? Mommy. I doubt you. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our State of the Nation breakfast. So nice to see everybody out here bright and early this morning. I want to kick off by thanking our partners that have made this possible. Pace Car Rental, where's Darren and his team? Thank you so much for your support. And Hotel Sky. We're going to be doing a few more of these kind of events here, and it's great to have a venue that we can that we've test driven, and we'll be doing more of these kind of events here. So let's hope that we'll be seeing a lot more of each other. But welcome. And I know the reason everybody is here is because you watch and love the State of the Nation podcast, and long may that last. But it's more because we have a rather important date with Destiny coming up in just over 2 weeks' time. Now, yeah, I spent a large part of my life working in financial markets, both in South Africa and abroad. And there's a thing in financial markets where what started out as a cliche has actually become something a little bit more than that, and that is that share prices are driven by fear and greed, fear or greed, right? And that is true with just about everything that you do commercially in life. That you're doing it either because you're scared of something, or you want to make more of something else. Now that's the reason why you would hold a share, either because you're greedy and you want to make more money, and that's fine, or you would sell it because you're scared that you're going to lose money. But either way, your decisions are driven by fear and greed. Well, that translates into your everyday life, your job that you may have, or the business that you run. You're running it out of fear or greed. It is quite simply that. And I know it sounds a bit simplistic, but think about it. You're either trying to do it, you're either pitching up at work because of the fear of not getting your salary at the end of the month and not paying your bills, or the greed, and that is that you want to make more money so that you can buy newer and fancier things and have a good time. And when you think about it like that, it informs just about every decision you make financially. Now, why am I starting off with that? Well, I want to just put forward that our politicians in this country and in every country may start out as some kind of calling. That doesn't last long. Pretty soon you've got to pay the rent or rent the G-Wagon, one of the two. But either way, it becomes your job. It becomes the way that you earn your money. And your living is going to be informed by fear or greed. And right now, and by the way, there is no doubt that both have a place. You can call it carrot and stick. You can call it all sorts of things, but you need that motivation. And it's all nice if we've got this motivation to make the world a better place. That may be why people get involved in politics in the first place, but I've grown to understand that idealism soon gives way to pretty much what most of us live with every day, and that is to try and make a living. And our politicians, in most cases, are even more desperate than many of us sitting around there today because they have fewer options. Those politicians can't leave their cushy parliamentary job and go back to their law practice because they never started the law practice to begin with. They can't go back to their job in their engineering company because they're not qualified to do anything, especially in South Africa, where many of our politicians came through struggle era, arrived in 1994 with not any money in the bank account, the big family to feed, suddenly get a parliamentary salary, and suddenly get driven by the fear of losing it. which then gave way to the greed of stealing more money and getting even nicer G-Wagons. So once again, if you think about that, it could explain to you why we suddenly have a lot of electricity. With best respects to some of my solar friends over here, right? And that is that if you read, and there's obviously two schools of thought. One school of thought is we're running the hell out of our diesel, our open cycle diesel generators. But it looks like there's no doubt that our energy availability factor, which is a very nice way to say how well our plants are being run, has improved dramatically. Why? Why now? Well, it's the fear of a year ago when it suddenly dawned on the ANC that they were going to lose their majority. So suddenly you go to those plant managers and unions and everybody else that had been sabotaging Eskom, and you say, guys, if this continues, we're going to lose power. So therefore, get your act together. Now, that sounds, don't let it sound sinister. We do this every single day, all of us, in our businesses, where we have to respond to normal market forces. Do your job, or people are going to go to the opposition. Right? Be it the other company who's going to take over that contract, or anything similar. So right now we've got a government that for the first time in, let's be kind and say 20 years, because let's say the first 10 years we were running on sentiment, but certainly for the last 20 years, that government's been run on greed, getting a nice fat salary and not doing anything for it. Suddenly, fear has come into it, and that's not a bad thing, because that probably is the reason why you get out of bed most mornings, is the fear of losing your job, losing your business, not putting food on the table. So we're sitting over here not to get some kind of trading lesson, but I'm putting this forward because I've got to say that politics ultimately works when we do have proper competition, because people are driven by the fear of losing their jobs. And that gives me a great deal of hope for the future, because we are heading into elections, and the thing that is going to be quite clear in these elections is that it looks highly unlikely, and we'll hear a bit more from the experts, that any of the parties are going to get an outright majority, i.e. the ANC. And that changes everything. Right? And I will leave it to Prince and Khaya and Bheki to tell us a little bit more about how that works out. But it definitely has implications that we are not thinking about. And when, like the rest of you, when I go to Bry's and people realize that I do this kind of thing, they say, oh, nothing's going to change. Well, if you ask me, everything's going to change. It is going to change. There's always a chance it changes for the worse. But I think that in this case, I'm a little bit more optimistic that things actually might just have a chance. And for that, I turn to Exhibit A, which is Eskom suddenly providing us with, 48 days of power, which we couldn't have believed a little while back. 49 days today, right? That is not because suddenly they said, oh, it'd be quite nice to give these poor suckers some electricity. That is because we desperately need their votes. And I don't think that, I think that the smaller the majority, or a party that doesn't have an outright majority, is going to be driven by that kind of fear throughout the year, throughout the election cycle. So let's wait and hear from the experts. So we've got a lovely morning planned here. We've got a couple of really top speakers. We all know and love Prince Mashele. Holds nothing, leaves nothing in the bag, as they say on the golf course. He's a guy who goes for it and says what's on his mind. And without question, our most popular analyst when we have him on the State of the Nation. We're going to hear from Prince later on, Khaya Sithole, when he does arrive. is a guy that manages to blend political analysis with economics. Qualified chartered accountant, and a guy who really understands, as well as anybody, the economic implications of politics. But we're going to kick off with a name to remember, a rising star in the world of analysis, Bheki Mahlobo, who is an analyst, and he works with Frans Cronje, who is a very popular contributor to State of the Nation and to the general conversation in South Africa. And leading up to the election, they have been at the forefront of providing some polling data for the forthcoming elections. And as I understand polls, as we get a little closer to the election, the picture starts emerging. It's going to be a little bit closer to the truth. So what I would like you to do is welcome on stage Mr. Bheki Mahlobo. Bheki.
Thank you so much. Mic check.
Thank you.
I think you're switching on the mic there.
There we go.
Oh, is it on? Thank you so much, everyone, for your time, and I'm deeply appreciative of the time that you've taken this morning, as well as to the people that's watching currently on stream. And to go straight to the core of the messaging that we have at Frans Cronje Private Clients is that we are actually a lot more positive than what you see in the South African press and the international media. There's a lot more upsides that we see in the South African economic landscape. Of course, there are headwinds, which is something we will definitely get into in the discussion section. But in general, South Africa is a free and open society. The country entered democracy in 1994 in order for its citizens to elect a government that was improving its life. And if it failed to do so, could also have the opportunity to vote out that government. And that's exactly what we're seeing in the current election cycle. So we're a free and open society. That's the first positive point. We're seeing a fragmentation in society where the private sector, the role of the private sector is becoming ever more insignificant. Should have been the case 10 years ago. However, as living conditions stagnate and the capacity of the state has receded, we're seeing the private sector become ever more important. We're seeing this in electricity, which as Mike touched on. But we're also seeing that in infrastructure as well. If you're looking at the movement of goods, compare that to roads as well as the rail and network. And we also see that with policing in the country. And if Matthew there can please bring up the charts here, this leads us to the polling that we see. And I think a good starting point is to actually look at the polling that's happening in the provinces. We're looking at a chart here that looks at the battleground provinces for Gauteng, the Western Cape, and KwaZulu-Natal. And I think the coalition scenarios that we'll see after the May 29th will be determined by what happens in these provinces, which contributes about 50% of GDP in South Africa. We start off by having a look at Gauteng. The ANC polls at near 40% in Gauteng. The DA is behind the ANC, polling near at 30% there, as well as that with the EFF at 10%. The IFP below that of the EFF. The MK, interestingly enough, is now polling at 5% in Gauteng. The Action SA as well as the Patriotic Alliance. What we're seeing in polling data, I preface the point I'm going to make, is that polls are not a predictor of the elections that we're going to see in May 29th. They're more of a snapshot. Public opinion changes drastically on a week-to-week basis, and that's exactly what we're seeing in South Africa's provinces, in battleground provinces. What we're seeing with the ANC is that the ANC is gaining quite a significant momentum in Gauteng. This part increasing its support to near 40%. And that support largely comes from the MK party, which was previously polling at about 11%, but is now polling at 5%. In the Western Cape, the ANC sits at about 20%. The DA still has a majority sitting there about 53%. Third to that is the EFF at below 10%, as well as what we see with the Patriotic Alliance gaining quite a lot of momentum in the Western Cape. What is interesting also in Western Cape is the decline in the DA support. It used to poll at near 60% when we started this daily tracker in the beginning of May, and is now flirting with a margin of error of actually losing the Western Cape as a majority. That is an important thing. The decline in voter support is not only seen amongst the ruling government, that being that of the ANC, but you're also seeing that with the DA in the Western Cape, and that's because of the rise in the momentum, what you see in the Patriotic Alliance. Interesting again, in KwaZulu-Natal, with the ANC support rising above 30%, compare that to the DA that's in the 20s, the IFP at 15%, and the MK party polling, they're about at 25%. What is interesting in this province that has emerged, the MK used to have a lead in KZN, but the ANC, through its campaigning, as campaign works, has overtaken the MK party in the province of KZN. And that is quite something. That's a political trend that we're seeing, and that is a nature in South Africa's national elections, that the ruling government tends to surge in the final weeks of an election as they ramp up their campaigns and as they get more people on the ground to go and vote, which is keeping the MK in check while dragging support away from the IFP, which used to be polling at above 20% when we started this tracker, but is now polling at 15%, as the ANC has taken much of that support levels. And what happens in these provinces will determine what we see with the coalition scenarios, which takes us to our next chart here, where we look at the coalition scenarios. I believe what's more important than the actual results of the elections is what comes after. In other words, what are the types of coalitions the country will see, or the lack thereof, and what will be those impact on bread and butter issues such as that of economic growth, such as that of jobs, fixed investment, as well as in foreign investor sentiment, things that are relevant for the people in this room as well as for the audience watching us at home. And I think you're going to largely see the results in three broad-based results. The first one is the ANC at near 50%. The second one is an ANC at above 50%. And I need to touch on this point just slightly. What we're seeing currently is that the ANC has gained quite a lot of momentum over the past 2 weeks. If you are reading what was coming from us, when we started our poll, the ANC was polling at about 37%. It is now polling at 44%, and take into consideration the margin of error of 2%, you can see an ANC polling at about 45% and near 50%. You should not discount an ANC at 50%. It in fact is indeed probable. The third type of results which you can see is an ANC at near 40%. But we start off by looking at the ANC at near 50%. And in this, what would a result of this look like? It would mean that the threat seen with the MK party would have fizzled out, and the ANC has managed to gain about 40% in Gauteng as well as that of KwaZulu-Natal. And say that the ANC polls at about 45%. The strategy they can use is the same strategy they had in place in 2022 as well as in 2023, where they were polling at near 50%. In that they can invite the IFP, which currently polls at 5% on the national poll, in order for it to gain a majority and give the IFP, the KZN, and the ANC to rule the other 8 provinces. With this result, Cyril Ramaphosa can stay at the helm of the ANC as well as that of being the president of the nation. But in terms of actual economic policy, there's not that much change that's going to occur in the country. We're still going to follow the same trajectory which we followed over the past 5 years, where growth is capped at 2% and the currency continues to trade at its volatile trend over the past 5 years. And with the inflation target remaining within the same range of about 3 to 6%. With an ANC above 50%, what we see here is that the threat of the MK party also fizzles out in this particular scenario, and the ANC continues to perform strongly while the DA significantly underperforms. An ANC at 50% is a positive result for Cyril Ramaphosa and may be enough for the man to stay at the helm of the ANC. However, again, in terms of the actual stuff that matters for business, for ordinary South Africans, economic policy doesn't change, leading to living standards to continue to stagnate, as well as the ANC to poll in the 40 percentiles by the year 2029, which is the same level it would poll at under the first scenario. And this particular scenario would see an initial positive surge in sentiment. This is the same of what we've seen in 2018 when Cyril came into the stage, where you saw a massive uptick in investor sentiment. You will also start to see that as well, as a stable result in these elections may alleviate concerns over South Africa's election cycle. But again, growth is capped at 2%. The currency continues to trade at its volatile nature over the past 5 years. Nothing much. Third scenario is an ANC at 40%. And here, there's a myriad of correlations that emerge. Firstly, for an ANC to poll at 40%, it would mean that the MK party still has the political momentum it has gained over the past few weeks. And the ANC suffered landslide defeats in provinces such as that of Gauteng, KwaZulu-Natal, as well as other rural parts of the country, such as that of Northern Cape, as well as the Northwest, including that of the more developed provinces, such as that of the Western Cape. As a consequence, we just need to think away a little bit here. What are the possible coalition scenarios with the ANC at close to 40%? Firstly, an ANC at 40% is a failure for a party that has a 100-year history. This is a failure for Cyril Ramaphosa and may risk him leaving the party. Just to touch on that just a little bit, with an ANC without Cyril Ramaphosa takes the party from where it currently polls at 44%, knocks it down to 30% if he leaves the party. That is a risk that cabinet officials cannot risk. They need the man as he holds the party together as well as he protects the cabinet officials. Therefore, they need to turn a negative into a positive, and they'll call this a historical moment in the country and call for a national convention. And in fact, the man himself, Cyril, may head this national convention, and out of this, a government of national unity will be formed. And what is that exactly? It is the calling for all political parties to form a coalition. The DA loses its distinguishing colors of blue, the Patriotic Alliance, every single party will be invited to form a government of national unity. And let's take it at face value. Assume that the ANC is willing to reform and actually has the appetite of reform. What are the consequences or the prospects that might emerge from this coalition scenario? It might usher in a decade of economic prosperity in the country as we start to see fundamental reforms being implemented. However, the reality on the ground is that the party at the moment simply lacks the appetite to implement fundamental reforms in the country. And it's a risk for opposition parties such as that of the DA, as they might also be marked with the branding that's currently prevalent with the maladministration, such as that of corruption, as well as the growth being capped at 2%. The DA knows this, and they're quite wary of a formal deal with the ANC. But at the same time, they cannot say no. As if they say no and they take themselves out of the negotiation table, the ANC could go to the EFF and form a coalition, and the economic consequences of that will be laid out towards the table of Helen Zille as well as that of John Steenhuisen. Therefore, they cannot say yes, and at the same time, they cannot say no. Therefore, they need to find a middle ground of this, and that middle ground is confidence and support agreement. And what this is an ANC minority government, but that is anchored in by the DA, where the DA and the ANC agree to elect a president, agree to elect a an executive committee, and veto motions of no confidence, which would prevent a collapse of the government, and for the government to continue its basic functions, such as of running budgets for infrastructure, for education, and the like. And the DA could benefit from this regard as it would gain oversight of key parliamentary oversights, which would be given quite a lot of power over the ANC and can continue to draw a distinguishing characteristic as a party known best for service delivery, particularly in Western Cape. For the ANC, they benefit with this coalition scenario, or the lack thereof, in that they do not need to give away their patronage networks to the EFF. As the coalition with the EFF, they would largely give away patronage to the EFF, as that party would hollow out the ANC. And then another important point that needs to be discussed is that the ANC and DA have a different voter base. For the ANC, it's predominantly based in rural areas and needs to attract the black middle income class category, which is not moving towards the DA, whereas the DA is mostly centered in urban areas and is a party known for being a multiracial party with a vibrant middle income class. So it's two different voters. And that's very important because the chaos that we saw after the 2021 local elections was that of chaos in the cities of Ekurhuleni as well as that of Johannesburg, because these political parties, opposition parties, were gunning for the same voter. And in this deal, it does not even need to be a formal deal. It does not need to be a formal written agreement in terms of a minority government by the ANC as well as the as well as the DA backing the ANC. There just needs to be an agreement that will veto all motions of no confidence, and both parties can benefit in this regard. The most feared outcome is that of an ANC and EFF coalition. In this regard, this is the worst scenario in terms of economic performance in the country. The first thing, what we're seeing now right now is NHI would ramp up significantly from just being signed to ever more encroachment on the private sector savings, as well as that of the ramping up of expropriation without compensation, and these leaders running to the printing press in order to print money to fuel populism in the country. That would take South Africa's inflation levels to the same levels as what we saw in Argentina in 2019, triple digits inflation, same levels as what we're seeing in Argentina, where its currency has lost over 100% of its value over the past 9 months. Fixed investment as a proportion of GDP would dwindle to single digits, and the country would see seeds of recessions in South Africa until the year 2029. What is prevalent in all of these 3 pillars is an ANC at about 40%. An ANC-EFF coalition will continue to see the decline in support. Therefore, it also raises the risk of South Africa not seeing a free and open 2029. In all of these scenarios, aside from the ANC and EFF coalition, a stable result in these elections might actually be perceived as a positive from a foreign investor's perspective. So long as the government can carry out its basic functions, such as that of passing the budgets, as well as that of, let's say, through a confidence and support agreement, where the ANC would get a lot of pushback in terms of its draconian policy proposals, I think what you could see after these elections could be a positive result in South Africa going towards the year 2029. And just to close off here, before I take off the slides here, I started off by saying that I'm much more optimistic of the country in its next 5 to 10 years. And I touched on that. But I need to also highlight the significance of the mindset of ordinary South Africans. South Africans are moderate in their way of thinking. We don't like violence. That is the whole reason why the EFF polls at 10%. As according to polling, 70% of registered voters view the EFF as a violent party. That's exactly why it polls at 10%, with a youth unemployment rate at 70%. There's a huge surplus of people that are economically excluded, and those people are not moving towards populism. That is a positive thing. As what is the alternative to that? You can see that what happened in northern parts of the country with violent revolution taking over with the transition of power. That's not what's happening in South Africa at the moment. The political system is working as intended. We are a free and open society that has democracy in South Africa. Another important point is that we have freedom of speech. Opposition parties, including that of the DA now with its ad campaign, that's being dragged out throughout the media and it's being spoken about in the media. It's not being jailed for that advert. John Steenhuisen is not purporting his speeches, saying his speeches behind prison bars. That's another positive for the country. And then the final point, or really the second final point, is the increase in significance of the private sector. We're seeing this in infrastructure, we're seeing this with energy, as well as that of policing. And South Africa is not printing money as well. What the South African Reserve Bank is doing with its interest rates being above that of global markets is actually positive for the currency. It's actually positive for inflation in terms of inflation coming down, and will not fuel the populism that would trigger a violent revolution in the country. Aside from the ANC-EFF coalition, I think in any of the 3 pillars, you could actually see a drive of positive sentiment towards the country in the next 5 to 10 years. Mike, I leave it to you. Thank you.
Right. We're going to use this one. I think it's going to work a little better. Bheki, thank you so much for that. We're going to interrogate that a little bit more. But later on, so if you've got questions, keep them handy. We're going to be putting them to our panel just now. Our next speaker, as I said, has got the wonderful ability of understanding economics as well as politics. He's also been a radio host on Power FM. But most importantly, you know those super fans, those ones that went to the World Cup, what's it, Mama Joy and Botha and those guys that went to the World Cup on our taxpayers' money last year. which we hated until we won the World Cup, then we were very happy about it. But there's a third super fan that I think only very few people know about, and that is Khaya Sithole. Now, Khaya Sithole manages to pitch up at some of the most incredible places that I have. He's my hero. When I grow up, I want to be like Khaya Sithole because he seems to be at every fantastic sporting event. And he even made it here this morning. Khaya, are you with us there? We can get you up here because I see you got the headdress on, which means that Kaya's ready for business. Khaya?
Thank you. It was not taxpayers' money in my case. Thank you very much. Good morning to everyone. So what Mike failed to do is that he said I only have 10 minutes to talk. And when you have 10 minutes to talk, slides are probably not going to get you there. So I'm going to try and be as brief as possible. And what I sort of wanted to focus on was a simple question of, in many of the scenarios that you saw earlier on, there is this very distinct possibility of a co-governance model in one way or another. And the question that a lot of people are curious about is, well, does this mean the beginning of the paralysis of government? Obviously, most people think that the paralysis started long ago, but obviously in this instance, it will be so explicit and unavoidable, all of us would have to confront it. And at the heart of that is obviously the simple reflection of what has happened, particularly since 2016 in some of the metros where we've seen a very chaotic way in which these things have been done. And obviously what that has done is that it is given the distinct impression that, you know, any model where there isn't a single party that is in charge of everything is a model that is doomed to fail. The problem with that line of thinking is that, well, it's not the line of thinking that works for the South African way in which the model has been created. So South Africa explicitly avoided this idea of saying, well, whoever gets the most votes is in charge. It simply said that you have to meet particular benchmarks. And of course, what that means is that unless you are at 50% and above, you have to negotiate with someone, you have to work with someone. Now, what is also quite interesting is a simple question of why this model has become so problematic to observe. And there are two answers to that, essentially. The first one is that those that have been very prominent in creating the chaos have been doing so in the places where things matter. And I'll explain to you what that means. The second one is that actually this idea of coalition and coalition governments started as far back as 2000. So South Africa has always had them. So in that version of the local government elections, we saw 20. Right now, South Africa has got 257 government structures at sub-national level. That's made up of 8 metros, 44 district municipalities, and 204 regular municipalities. Now, of those 257, right now 86 of them are actually hung councils. In other words, those 86 are being governed through these particular coalitions. So a third of South Africa's governance system already today is subject to such a model. Does that mean that a third of the country is dysfunctional? Well, again, there's two answers to that. Some people think the country is dysfunctional, whatever permutation using, but the question is it dysfunctional because of those hung councils? And then it takes you back to the question of what the difference was between 2016 and 2021. So in 2016 and in 2021, it was the first time that the Big 8 essentially were subject to this coalition arrangement. So when you talk about the Big 8, you're talking about the big metros, which is obviously where the biggest budgets are. And the important difference between the Big 8 versus the other 249 is obviously not only because they've got much bigger budgets, but also the way in which they've been put together is slightly different. So of the 8 metros, you actually have a model of 7 versus 1. And when we say 7 versus 1, it is 7 metros run in a particular way, and then eThekwini run differently. And of course, the reason Durban is run differently is because ever since South Africa became a democracy in 1994, you can never escape the need to placate or the need to get together or work together with the IFP. So the model that was designed in eThekwini was essentially designed with the need not to piss off or alienate the IFP. And what that meant is that in the other 7 metros, when I become the mayor, I then have the unilateral right to appoint the 10 members of my mayoral committee, the 10 MMCs, and these 10 MMCs are then in control of what we refer to as municipal entities. And obviously the municipal entities, whether it's City Power, whether it's Pick It Up, or whichever other one is, those are the municipal entities where obviously there's the question of, well, who runs it, what do they do, and who governs it. And that already creates a very big, a large potential network of whether you call it patronage networks or whatever else you look at it. And what we've seen over the past 7 or 8 years is that the domino effect of what happens in the council chamber has been very detrimental to service delivery. So what happens is that as soon as there's a motion of no confidence or the rumor of a motion of no confidence, you already start seeing the chill effect throughout the system in that, well, if there's going to be a new mayor and I'm only the MMC because of the current mayor, if this mayor does not emerge as the winner, then I won't have my job, right? If I won't have my job, the people that I've appointed to the boards of these municipal entities are probably also not going to keep their jobs. And the people that run the municipal entities, whether it's CEOs and whatnot, are probably also going to start asking, well, who are we accountable to? So what we see is that as soon as there is this rumblings of a potential vote, then the entire system freezes. And the reality is that whenever there is a new mayor, you've then seen the overhaul of those entire structures. So obviously the one that we all pay attention to is what happens with the MMCs, because that's what they publicly communicate to us. But behind the scenes, what you'll see is that that MMC, the first thing they'll do is to say to all those existing boards, you must stop whatever you're doing because we need to figure out whether you're the right people to be doing whatever it is that you're doing anyway. So they tend to dismiss all those particular boards, and obviously you can imagine what happens to the bureaucrats that are supposed to be doing the work. They kind of feel like, well, we don't have a political instruction, so therefore we're not going to do anything, right? What makes eThekwini different is that in Durban, the idea was that, well, even if you win this particular election, you kind of don't want to lock the IFP completely out of the room now, do you? So what will happen there is that if you want 60% in that particular area of the country, you will then only have 6 of the 10 seats on the table, and the other 4 would then go to whoever got the 40%. Now that ironically has created a greater sense of stability within that particular structure compared to the others, in the sense that it isn't this wholesale trade-off of we're going to take the gamble and take all 10 seats and therefore completely paralyze everything. Now, whether the answer is to simply say, let us look at the Durban model and replicate it across the country, I do not know. But the reality here is that we are going to be stuck with this question of who can co-govern with each other. And when they do co-govern with each other, it isn't in our interest to try and overhaul democracy and try and prevent people from losing confidence in each other. I mean, the reality is that even before they start their jobs, we have already lost confidence in them. So we do not have the moral authority to say that within the chamber they shouldn't lose confidence in each other. So they're going to do this. The question that we should all be deliberating is whether you can then actually create particular guardrails across that that domino effect that insulates the service delivery dimension from what happens in there. In other words, is it possible for those that have been given the responsibility to do things to carry on doing things regardless of whether there's a pending vote and regardless of which way that vote goes? And if that is possible, then it will mean that regardless of what happens within that particular chamber, the things that matter to citizens are still being able to be executed. And that is probably the biggest win that you can get with the governance structure that we have. Any other alternative would require you to go and revisit the entire architecture of the Constitution, revisit the entire definition of what subnational government looks like, and at this stage it's very unlikely that you're ever going to get enough consensus amongst parliamentarians to reach those type of draconian amendments to the way things are done. So that's unlikely to happen. So if in the instance that you do actually end up with a system that creates an element of insulation for service delivery to thrive regardless of who's in charge, then perhaps we may find a more functional government going forward. So what is happening in recent times is that there have been a lot of conversations that are actually trying to crack that egg. So there was one that was started by Paul Mashele that was hosted in Cape Town towards the end of last year, and obviously people made their particular contributions. In recent weeks, there's been another one where they only invited the non-represented political parties, in other words, the new ones, to be able to sort of get their inputs. There's also been some case studies that have been conducted to compare what happens in other governments. So those are the conversations that are going on. We do not know whether those conversations will have the same momentum after 29 May, because if it turns out that the ANC gets 50%, the ANC will say, well, clearly there was no problem to begin with. People will have voted the same way they've done in the past 30 years, so therefore, never mind what everybody else has been saying that we must do. So the conversation might die on the 29th of May if the ANC feels it's no longer necessary. However, if the ANC then feels that, well, there's no other way except for us to co-govern with other people, then those conversations will obviously translate into new policy orientations, new policy frameworks on how these structures ought to happen in order to be able to insulate the system from itself. And that, of course, for me, is going to be the big takeaway that happens after 29 May. And obviously the question that I can never avoid, who's going to be in charge? Whatever form of government we have on 29 May, the ANC will be at the epicenter of it. So whether it's because they have won outright, which is still a very likely scenario, or whether it's because they are the leading party that then required 2 or 3 smaller hands in order to be able to co-govern, they're still them. But even in the extreme scenario where you put them down at either 40% or whatever the case might be, they're going to be the stumbling block to whatever alternative formation exists. And the reason they'd be the stumbling block is that, again, even in that completely unlikely scenario, in my view, you have to be able to acknowledge that for 30 years, the ANC has had an open corridor in terms of policy making. What that means is that the ANC has had the capacity to initiate and execute every single policy and every bill from start to inception without having to call anyone, because they were in charge of the National Assembly and also in charge of the National Council of Provinces. Now, in the scenario where the ANC is no longer in charge of the National Assembly, the ANC is still going to be charging the National Council of Provinces. The National Council of Provinces votes in blocks. So every province sends a particular delegation. So even in the scenario of extreme unlikeliness for the ANC, they would still probably have won 5 of the 9 provinces. So if they win 5 of the 9 provinces, decision-making at the National Council of Provinces requires at the very least 6 of the 9 provinces to agree on something in order for it to be passed. So if you look at the National Health Insurance Bill, for example, we all know that the vote was 8 out of 9 because the Western Cape said no. The Western Cape didn't say no because people in the National Council of Provinces applied their minds and then said, no, we do not like this bill. No, it is simply because the delegate of the Western Cape is a delegate from a province that is run by the DA. So the DA's position on the National Health Insurance Bill is a decision that that particular delegation would have adopted, so therefore that's how they would say no. So why that matters is that if the ANC is not able to sort of control things in the National Assembly, and then somebody else manages to get a bill to exit the National Assembly and make it so to the National Council of Provinces, and then the National Council of Provinces says, no, we do not like this, only then will we see the chaos of the paralysis that might happen when you've got a mixed model. But otherwise, we still need to find a way of making things work. Thank you.
Well, that was interesting, and we're definitely going to be talking a little bit more about some of those points. And now we have the one and only, you know, somebody taught me once before, if you stay on stage, the next speaker needs no introduction, then you shouldn't introduce him, surely. But the next speaker needs no introduction, Prince Mashele.
Thanks, Mike. I didn't know that I don't need to be introduced. Good morning. Good morning, I'm greeting, it's real. You know, we usually think these are formalities, you know. I don't know what to say after such great speakers, and all the scenarios have been mapped out, and I don't think I have anything to say except to conclude. My first concluding point is that we are lucky to be living in South Africa today. Lucky in the sense that we are going through a historic moment. We may not appreciate it because often when history happens, the living are so engrossed in their daily problems or noise and so on that they actually lose sight of the bigger picture. The bigger picture is we are going through the fall of a political empire, the African National Congress. It's huge. It's not small. I was 18 in 1994. Registered for matric in Jan. My president was F.W. de Klerk. I wrote examination in October. My president was Nelson Mandela. That was a huge moment historically, if you think of it. And that was the fall of an empire, the National Party. Those who lived through that, that was historic. Fast forward 30 years later, I'm almost 50. I've seen through the rise of the ANC in power, and now I am living through the fall of the ANC. This is the fall. The ANC is not coming back. Make no mistake, the ANC is not coming back. And I'll talk about scenarios. So we are lucky in that sense. But we're also unfortunate, and this we'll have to figure out, and the younger generations will have to figure out how to sort out this problem that accompanies the fall of this empire. So there was a time when the National Party held South Africa together. I mean, South Africa is a very difficult country to hold together, by the way. We are many nations in one. Afrikaners, Zulus, Shangans. By the way, there's nothing that brings us together, if you think of it, even physically. By the way, the vendors, the majority of vendors are in Venda. They've been living in Venda. The majority of Zulus have been living in KwaZulu-Natal. If you look at what brings us together, and this is the unfortunate part of it, is that the ANC over the past 30 years, whether we like it or not, has actually held us together. So you go to Zirast, you go to Komati Port, you go to Musina, you go to Guguletu. Most of these South Africans, wherever they are, they felt that they belonged to something bigger. And they felt that the ANC was them. Even whites, by the way, even white South Africans, there is a component of white society that felt the ANC was part of them. Even Indians, coloreds, we all felt that. So when this empire dies, the question is, all of these parties that are emerging, is there one of them that has the potential of making us feel that we belong together? That is a question that I suppose the younger generations will have to contend with. The second concluding point I want to make is that this fall of the empire introduces what many of you have been calling for many years. What have you been calling for? You've been worried about the dominance of one part. Been following what you say in the media. You have been very worried about the dominance of one party. And by the way, you have been worried, I think rightly, if you look at the latest record of the African National Congress as a governing party. The ANC started very well, 1994. I would say that for the first 15 years, the ANC was a sane party. We felt that we were going somewhere as a country. But after that, it lost its mind. The party lost its mind. And the damage it has done to South Africa is massive. It has actually destroyed the vestiges of a South African state that was actually created, ironically, by its first 15 years as a governing party. It's destroyed the South African state. If you look at the pillars of a state, very few of those pillars are sound. Just destroyed that. But then you should be happy because the departure of the ANC introduces what you've been calling for, which is real political competition. So for the first time from this election going forward, we are not sure who is going to govern South Africa. It's real political competition. And that's how democracy works, right? Democracy works when you are not sure who's going to be the next guy. But if you are sure all the time who's going to be the next guy, then that democracy it's not real. So in real democracies, competitive democracies, and let's face it, those established and experienced democracies are in the main in Western Europe and North America. In the main, if you look at, and in those societies, you're not sure who is going to be in government. It's competitive. So that was my second concluding remark, which is real competition. Let me talk about the third. I've got four. The third concluding remark. Scenarios have been painted. Let me just put my neck on the block. And I'm known to be foolish in that regard. I do put my head on the block. Come 29 May, the days after, the ANC, exiting as it is exiting, will still be at the center of that governing arrangement. But it's exiting, but it will still be at the center of that governing arrangement. I agree with my colleagues. So the question is, the ANC with which other party? That's the real question here. Is the ANC and which other party? And in my view, it's in the main the ANC with either three parties. Is the ANC either with the EFF, that would happen if for some miracle Cyril Ramaphosa were not to be in charge of those negotiations and he were to exit. If he were to exit, Paul Mashele immediately assumes power in the ANC because the deputy. Then that would give us the ANC plus the EFF. My sense is that it won't happen. The second scenario is the ANC with the DA. If the ANC were to get less than 45%, and my sense is that it will get between 40 and 45%. It won't cross the 45% on, to the other side. If the ANC were to get 42%, it would need a significant partner to form a government. And I see the ANC in that scenario going with the DA, with Cyril Ramaphosa being in charge and will still be president. But that government, and maybe I should reserve that for my last point. The third scenario, the ANC on the other side of 45%, it goes with the IFP. And that would be easy. Still Cyril Ramaphosa as president. They would negotiate, maybe give the IFP KwaZulu-Natal. So those are, in my view, the three scenarios we're dealing with. The moonshot pact, whatever John Steenhuisen calls it, it's not going to happen. The fellow is just... My last concluding remark, which is the fourth, it's... So under these scenarios, the three scenarios, would South Africa be politically stable? That's the question. My answer is yes. South Africa would still be politically stable. What would keep an arrangement like that stable? That's the question. Either party, because remember my scenarios involve the ANC and another party. So there will be two in government. Would know that if we let this government fall, we are gone. We are going to be replaced by another. But obviously the ANC wouldn't be replaced. It would be the smaller party that would be replaced. So there would be an incentive in an arrangement like that for the smaller party to stay in that government. If you don't, you can be replaced. And by the way, the other parties that would be outside would actually keep on shaking the tree so that the monkeys fall. And if smaller monkey falls, they would come in, climb the tree. So it would be in the interest of the smaller party to make sure this thing works. So if we have an arrangement like that, we must expect that it will run until the next election. And that would be an important part, that would be an important pillar of political stability for the next 5 years. What about policy coherence? It would be a negotiated settlement. The ANC wouldn't get everything it wants in an arrangement like that. It would be sensitive to the fact that there is another player here. We need to listen to them. So it won't be an ANC government. So the ANC government that we have been used to over the past 30 years, from the 29th of May going forward, will be no more. It won't be a situation where the ANC now dictates terms. There will be another party. That smaller part, whether it's the EFF, the DA, or the EFF, will also want to get something from this arrangement. So it will be, if you like, an ANC-light government. An ANC-light government. Not quite an ANC government, ANC-light government. And it would obviously depend on which smaller party is in that arrangement. If it is the DA would do a lot to put brakes on many things. If it is the DA. If it is the EFF, it would do very little to put on brakes. Because it would be weak. It would 4%, 5%, you are in government. It would know that we are lucky to be in this thing. So we must not block the ANC a lot. So if the DA, if it's the EFF would drag the ANC to the left, to the far left. And that scenario, I think, would be very dangerous for South Africa. So that's my fourth concluding point. I am optimistic about the future of this country over the next 5 years. It's not going to be as chaotic as people think it will be. But as I said, we are witnessing the fall of the empire. The ANC will not win KwaZulu-Natal. And the entry of MK, by the way, is a very important factor in KwaZulu-Natal, because that will drag the ANC below 40%, I think. In the previous local government elections, the reason why the ANC sat around 40, in the mid-40s in the local government elections is because it was dragged down to 41% in KZN, and it was also dragged down below 40% in Gauteng. And these two things will happen in this election. So don't expect that the ANC will hit 50%, with it having been dragged below 40% in KZN and below 40% in Gauteng, because these two provinces have about 40% or so of our country's population. Let me end here and let's have a discussion. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Prince, and thank you to Bheki and Khaya. What we're going to do quickly is we're going to get them back on stage. We're just going to bring some chairs up. So if you would like to go and grab a cup of coffee, or perhaps go for a comfort break, just give us 5 minutes while we put the chairs up here on the stage, and get ready with those questions. So we'll see you now. 5 minutes is all we need.
You surprised the hell out of poor old Prince over there. Prince and the revolution. Right, we're waiting for our last couple of people to come inside. Okay, I think we've got just about...
Where did he go? I just stepped outside.
Right. Okay, we very mindful of the fact that half the economy is sitting here at the moment, so we can't keep everybody here forever. So what I would like to do is I would like to invite our speakers back up here, sitting in very comfortable chairs here, please. Prince, Bheki and Khaya, thank you very much. For your contribution so far. To everybody out there, please get ready with those questions. That'll be great to hear from you. Khaya, do you have a microphone?
No.
Oh, you're using a...
We'll share. People shall
No,
share.
no. These are fine when we don't have those other attachments on. Right, so some great contributions there. And certainly, as you would know, I've always got a few questions. I'm going to kick off with some of the things that were said earlier. And, well, before we get to questioning some of the numbers, I just want to talk about some of the optics that we've been seeing lately. And that is that I'm seeing two things that are quite interesting to me. You know, quite easy to accuse the DA of, in the wake of the 2019 election, they seem to have been absolutely spooked by, what was it, the 400,000 votes that they lost to the Freedom Front Plus. And suddenly they had to kick out Musi Maimane and bring back a white leader. And I presume that was in response to the Freedom Front Plus taking a couple of votes. Well, now we see the ANC moving, sounding more radical than the EFF. And in actual fact, we're seeing Julius Malema. Quite a funny thing, if you've noticed recently, Julius Malema no longer wears an overall. He's just been wearing a dark suit, looking very much like a business executive. And what I'm going to do is I would like to just ask, what do we make of this? Do we think that, you know, is this some kind of signaling from the ANC and the EFF that they are moving more in alignment, Prince? Do you think we can read anything into those two things, or do you think they're completely separate to one another?
Yeah, let me start with the easy one, the EFF. Look, all the polls that I have seen, the recent ones, suggest that the EFF is not going to grow as dramatically as they hoped it would. The earlier polls, you will recall, some of them placed them around 18%. Yeah. But now the polls are actually now around 11%, thereabout. And the EFF leadership is very concerned about that. They do discuss these things. And their interpretation is exactly, I think, what you said, that most South Africans view it as a violent party, a violent, radical party. Even the unemployed who have been failed by the ANC don't think that their prospects would improve under an EFF government. So the posture, the change of posture on the part of Julius to ditch the overall, because the overall represents violence and the mayhem that they've been causing in Parliament, is that let's ditch this overall thing so that people can believe when we say we can govern better, we can actually be leaders of society. So that is what I think explains why Julius is changing his posture and is teaching the overall. The DA is the most difficult one. Tony Leon said that Musi was an experiment gone wrong, close quote. Yeah, these are his words, close quote. An experiment gone wrong. And let's be honest about it. Musi was an experiment, the first black leader of the DA. He was an experiment. And when there is an experiment, there are people who run that experiment. An experiment doesn't just run itself. There are people somewhere who sit, who manage the experiment. And who are these people? Are white South Africans, white leaders of the DA. They used to sit in some boardroom somewhere and say, how are we going to handle this experiment? And when the Freedom Front Plus showed an uptick in the last election, the runners of the experiment said, my goodness, we are going to lose our base. Let's discontinue the experiment. But that has serious implications for the party, in the sense that the only potential for the DA to grow would be to win more and more black voters. So if you don't win more and more black voters, even if you win more and more white voters, you are actually not going to grow and become a government of South Africa. You would be mad to imagine that you're going to govern South Africa without the votes of black people. They happen to be the majority of this thing we call South Africa. So the DA has now painted itself into a corner. It is now perceived, and by the way, it is actually a white party. Just look at the structure. Even in the Western Cape, the DA had this, the runners of the experiment used to have this policy. The premier is white, and the mayor of Cape Town is colored, or vice versa. They were very sensitive. They got to a point where they said, we don't care anymore. We will have a white premier and a white mayor of Cape Town because we are in charge. They thought now they had won colors, and Gayton McKenzie is teaching them a lesson. So let's see how the DA is going to navigate these waters going into the future.
Yeah, and don't you dare say that to the DA, because thanks to my nephew Mark, and we had an interview, I'm now banned from speaking to John Steenhuisen for saying exactly what you said. So
they can ban me. They can ban me if they want. I mean,
we'll talk to each other. And just lastly, Prince, while we've got you on a similar line, the ANC sounding more almost radical, more to the radical side of their policies. You know, obviously we've got Panyaza Lesufi off the hook. Yeah, in Gauteng going mad, promising everything. I think everyone's going to get a G-Wagon. He's become Oprah Winfrey. But, you know, talking about all of these sort of social programs and staunchly defending all of these policies that are being questioned, BE and the like. Do you think that, are they also responding to the potential of lost votes to MK, EFF?
Yeah, I hope they give me they start with me, give me the G-Wagon first.
Yeah.
Yes, the narrative, the ANC is not worried about the narrative that comes from the DA, by the way. Forget it. Because I understand that the DA is a party for white people. That's what it is. Just like, and by the way, when you say the DA is a party for white people, you find white South Africans sitting up. But there are also parties in South Africa that are parties for black people. That's South Africa. I mean, Andile Mnitama's party, the Black First, Land First, whatever they call it, it's actually a party for black. The EFF is a party for black people. So there's nothing wrong with the DA being a party for white people. Just just chose it as, yeah. So the ANC doesn't worry much about the DA. It worries mainly about parties that claim to represent black people. So the biggest headache for the ANC now are in the main two parties. Umkhonto weSizwe Party, because what is the slogan of Umkhonto weSizwe? Maibuye, right? What's the translation in English? Maibuye. The return of the land to black people. So the ANC is worried about that. And they know what the damage that it can cause in KZN. They're also worried about the EFF. So if you're worried about these two parties that are parties for black people, what do? You speak the language that they speak, right? By promising more and more radical goodies to black people. In short, that's why the ANC is speaking like that.
So we're going to hear John Steenhuisen speaking Afrikaans soon.
Yeah.
Khaya, you mentioned something which is obviously, you had this wonderful example of the difference, eThekwini's run compared to some of the other metros, but you also mentioned something which is going to happen, and that is a relative paralysis in Parliament. It's going to happen because it's going to be very difficult to get a majority through to pass laws. Now, the question is that a bad thing? Because sometimes, over the last couple of years, it's felt like Parliament has felt like they just have to pass laws. Just like you can't leave street names unchanged. You just have to change them. Whether it helps, harms, it doesn't matter. It's just like there's no gain out of it, but you just got to be seen to be doing something. And sometimes you just want to, sometimes my advice to South Africa is just calm the hell down. Do you think the paralysis that is going to happen without this sort of accepted majority that the ANC has had for 30 years is a bad thing?
No. So what I said earlier on is that the ANC has had this open corridor. The problem with open corridor is that it has muted the impact of what is supposed to be a central pillar of lawmaking, which is the public participation process. So if you listen to the hysteria that's going to happen today, and that's going to escalate at 2 p.m., so you must watch your TV screens at 2 p.m., a lot of the objections to what's going to happen at 2 p.m. is the fact that people look at the origins of that bill, they look at what they contributed in that policy-making, public participation process, and they look at the final version, and it feels like nothing has changed. And the reason that's become the case is that, again, the ANC has had absolute veto power over all of these things. So if they say, yes, we've considered the public participation and this is still the version of the bill, it kind of then becomes difficult for us to know, well, what do we do next, right? So that's been the way that it's been done in the past 30 years. And the consequence of having that open corridor is that it's easy to get bad laws through the system because, well, you simply don't have any powers that are going to say to you, well, actually, this is completely untenable, right? Now, what happens with a model where there's greater interrogation is that we're going to see a bigger focus on making sure that some of the most obvious glaring loopholes in some of these draft bills are going to be nipped in the bud on the basis that, well, you are not going to even get it through that portfolio committee that deliberates on it because there's obviously these clear flaws that simply won't make it a viable prospect when it gets to the National Assembly. So it might improve the quality of the initial deliberations regarding what exactly is being synthesized in the type of laws that they're trying to make. So that's the one upside of it. Then the secondary problem is when you then get to the process of, well, we now need to pass the bill. Can you buy enough consensus? Can you reach enough hands across the aisle to be able to say, okay, this is a bill that we can all agree to, so therefore let us make it happen? So you're going to see what we've seen in recent years is that bills of convenience that benefit everyone tend to make their way through. So the Electoral Matters Amendment Act, for example, obviously all of them had a material interest in doing things a particular way, so that was never going to be hamstrung. So the way the Political Party Funding Act obviously has now been left in this accountability vacuum is something that's in the collective interest of all the represented parties, so of course no one is going to block it. So we've seen that when it comes to bills of convenience, these parties know how to find a way. But I think what we're going to expect to see is that obviously within the spectrum of bill making, I don't know if you guys remember the differences. So there are some bills that are obviously so important in nature, everybody has to agree. So constitutional amendments, you absolutely have to get as much consensus as possible. So that would probably be 74 bills, and then Section 75, 76, it depends on whether they need the concurrence of provinces. And then you've got the money bills. The money bills are processed separately because they're supposed to be done in the shortest time possible. So you can't have a 3-month consultation period for a budget, for example. So you've got a short time frame in relation to the money bills. The other bills are going to go through these particular processes, and these are the bills that have not been interrogated well enough in the past. And I think with the much less powerful ANC, then you're going to see equality improving in relation to that. Whether they eventually make it into law is something that only the parliamentary chamber will decide.
Okay, so because I've always likened it to that, you know, a pen like this. Can anybody sit with a pen like this in their hand and not click it? You know, that's what it seems like with Parliament. They can't just sit there and run the country. They have to change laws, right? Because they've got that pen in their hand. Bheki, you mentioned it in number, but I think everybody mentioned it in one way or another, and that is, we saw the country united suddenly loving the flag because the DA burned it. And the message was, you know, let's avoid this doomsday coalition, as they put it. You know, as a South African, with this threat hanging over us for the last 30 years, do you not feel that it's just time to do the dice with death? Get it over and done with. Do the coalition with the EFF. Let the rand go to 200 to the dollar. Let inflation go to 100%, and get this out of our system.
Not at all.
Yeah, but I'm not. Sorry.
Yeah.
Before you answer it, and
Yeah.
to the point, saying, yeah, I get thousands of comments in response to the videos, and yes, I do read them, which I know is always a bad idea. But most of those comments are from very angry EFF people, saying that, you know, I've got some kind of, I'm getting paid by Stellenbosch or whatever. But the point is that you've got people in South Africa that, and a significant number, that really want to do this dice with death. And the only way to get that out of the system is to do the dice with death. You know what I mean? You know, sometimes you've got to let that kid touch the stove. And I'm just wondering if it isn't time to do that so that South Africa can get this out of their system, and we can, you know, the people in this room, and not just limited to us, we can make a decision that, you know, do we stay or do we go? Is there a case that you could put forward for that, or do you think it's just such a bad idea you don't even want to answer the question?
I think a great starting point is to actually understand what's at stake with that scenario. When it comes to a death type of situation, I think it's also important to have a look at the historical context of the country. There has been a time in which South Africa did achieve success. We doubled the number of people employed. Proportion of households without electricity declined from 50% to below 20%. For every one shack, there were 10 formal houses that were built. That was an ANC that promised a better life for all, and was indeed delivering on that promise. The ANC that we didn't see now is completely different. To the point where over the past 10 years, we've netted about 2 million jobs, and where GDP per capita is even lower than 2019. I mean, I had a conversation here with the head chef of this wonderful venue, and he told me how hard business has been after 2020. And for millions of South Africans, they see the harshness of that. And for some of them, still have jobs, but there's a huge surplus of the economically excluded population in the country. And I think with that scenario, it would grow ever more higher, to the point where bread prices, basic necessities, look at what's happening now in Nigeria, look at what's happening even in Argentina, where you need 2 barrels of money, printed money, to buy a simple loaf of bread. That is a dangerous scenario in which the country could find itself. We would see a massive capital outflow out of South Africa, fixed investment decline in the single digits. I think having a clear picture of what are those indicators that would begin to reverse, such as that of employment, such as that of investment in the country, such as that of growth. I don't think that's a thing we should play.
Well, you and I will agree with each other, and I'm sure the panel will agree, and I'm sure most of the people will agree on it. But I do want to raise some realities here. That example that you gave of better governance, because it was hardly good. Back then we were moaning about it because we could have been growing at 8%. We could have been doing much better, but, you know, Thabo Mbeki was hardly Ronald Reagan, you know. But the point is that that was 15 years ago.
Yes.
In other words, if you are anywhere under the age of 40, right now, you've never really experienced economic growth in this country. You don't, what you've just said is, you might as well be speaking a different language to the majority of South Africans. You know, I watched that dreadful Tucker Carlson interview with Vladimir Putin, and you want to say that can only be done by somebody that doesn't remember people risking life and limb to leave the Soviet Union because it was so bad. Now the guy is shining Vladimir Putin's helmet. Now you've got to say to yourself, sometimes you just need that collective memory back, you know, for people to make the right decisions. And, you know, the world seems to be in that space at the moment where the last 20 years have been different, and we've got a generation of people that don't remember certain things. But I'm concerned in South Africa, we've got a generation of South Africans that don't know what economic growth is when you speak about it. I had JJ Tabani, if anybody watched the interview I did with him, where he says, well, capitalism has failed. Just like that, right? Capitalism has failed. And who's saying that? The capitalists are saying that. But yet, you know, they've never lived so well ever. You know, I'm really asking that, and we're going to ask, you know,
Yes.
is it, how do we get to the point where what you've just said permeates, other than for us to go, you know, sorry, I've got the microphone, so it's going to be like it. You know, when we negotiated the settlement in 1994, that came on the back of a couple of generations of people that said, we don't want to live like this anymore. Now you've got someone like Julius Malema saying, well, it was a sellout. It wasn't a sellout. It was a standoff. It was an agreement, right? And, you know, Prince, the dice with death.
Yeah, look, here's the thing. In South Africa, we have had 3 governments in the history of modern South Africa. If you look at the bigger picture, 3 governments. We've had the government of the English. That was the first government to govern the entire thing called South Africa. We've had the government of the Afrikaners, and we have the government of black people. These are the 3 governments we've had in the history of modern South Africa. When the government of the English was in charge, what did it do? It created the English capitalists, and in partnership with the Jews, they owned and ran mines. They educated the English and Jewish kids. At the end of that story, there was no poverty among the English. The Afrikaners, when they took over, they created parastatals, and a few capitalists created industry, Afrikaner control and run industry, educated Afrikaner kids. At the end of the story, there was no poverty among Afrikaners. By the way, Afrikaners at some point were poorer than black people have ever been poor. There was a thing called the poor white problem. It was, let's not get there. So that's the second government. The third government, which is the government of black people, has committed a historic injustice against its own people. Number one, it failed to create an industry we can point to and say, this is the component that was added by this black government to the whole economy. We can say what the Afrikaners did. They created parastatals, right? And some industries. We can't point at this segment of the economy that the black government has added, right? Number one. Number two, it has failed to educate its children. So at the end of the story, which is 30 years later, there is actually poverty and hopelessness on the part of black children. So you saying we must test death. Death would mean that the poverty that we see among black would be multiplied 10 times. The poverty that we see among black would be multiplied 10 times. And when that happens, it will disrupt the entire system that we have in South Africa. Everything would be disrupted. Those of you who are lucky enough, you can leave and go somewhere. Those of us who are unlucky by virtue of my skin color, the Zimbabweans can come here. Where do we go? So we must never gamble with that kind of scenario. We must, all of us, it is in our interest to make sure that doomsday does not come to South Africa. Because the greatest losers, actually, will be black people.
We get that in the comments every day.
Yeah, sorry,
Big-
Mike. I don't mean to
No.
bring the discussion back, but I just wanted to touch on the point that you've raised. The reason why I highlight the early success of South Africa is that it sets up quite a dangerous precedent, I believe, if the success story of the country is in the early years of its democracy. Through my economics qualification, none of the achievements of what the country achieved in 1994 were discussed. Didn't touch on jobs, didn't touch on what we were achieving in the fiscus, didn't touch in terms of the university entrances that improved in those years. And when you have predominantly the youth that don't have that lived experience, which is mainly centered around the elderly population, that's where within the youth vote, the ANC vote is quite low compared to the elderly population dwelling in rural areas where ANC support, they're sitting about 70%, compare that to the urban vote at 30%. The reason why I highlight that is that when we start to look at pessimism, when you have a pessimistic outlook and we start to say that the country has never achieved success over its past 30 years, I think it makes us to take drastic decision for South Africa to see success after these elections in the next 10 years. I think a clear trend that we've clearly established here is that ANC decline is almost guaranteed at this point. And it's because it has moved away from those successes. In living conditions, it hasn't improved. The second thing which we've also touched on is in terms of that lived experience, which is amongst the younger population, which is dominant in the country right now, compared to the elderly population that is dying out. That's another death knell for the party. A third death knell of the party is that ANC voters by themselves are starting to lead the party rather than its own leaders. You can look at voters within ANC that support joint coalition for a party that at 70% in 2004 is now considering joining a coalition. That is a failure, a decline in support. Within its own voters, majority of ANC voters say you must scrap away with minimum wages, as well as that of hiring on race-based empowerment policies within the civil service. These are their own voters that's moving away from the core messaging of the party, marking another death knell within the ANC. So I highlight that given that there's quite a lot of pessimism in the media, and I think I'm actually a lot more optimistic than I am pessimistic. I think if we achieve a stable result, which I think could be likely after these elections, South Africa could be the most interesting emerging market over the next 10 years. Given the resilience of the private sector, given what's happening with free markets at the moment, when you start to see high-intensity load shedding, what do you see? Solar panels in the roofs of shopping malls. You're seeing an increase in private generation capacity, taking away from the national grid. Another point which is not highlighted enough is what Eskom did in terms of improving the country's energy situation. We've increased our coal production by 3,000 megawatts, which is something we should have done. We should have increased our reliance on reliable electricity and not on expensive alternatives. And that's not a knock on solar panels and the like. I think if individuals would like to buy solar panels, they should do so, even if that is that of Eskom. But to have a nation that is solely reliant on something that's vastly expensive, that the country cannot afford, it's an economy that's been growing below 2% over the past 10 years. We need a cheap form of energy source, and that's what Eskom has been doing by increasing coal production, by increasing its maintenance. A third point is what we're seeing in infrastructure. As you're seeing rail networks stagnate over the past 10 years, you're seeing more trucks on the road as the movement of goods has moved from rail towards roads. That is the resilience of South Africa's private sector. And I think will become even more important over the next 10 years.
Khaya, you speak to a lot of professionals. accountants, people, that should know better, and I'm sure a good number of them are sympathetic towards the EFF. Do you like my idea of doing the dice with death?
Look, I don't think it's necessary for us on this panel to like or not like the idea, but to actually explore the possibilities of it happening. So the reason that's even a conversation is that, again, if you have a system where so many people feel alienated and excluded, it is difficult to go and intellectualize that and sort of then deal with their anxieties, because for them it's like, well, you keep saying to me that, under that scenario things would be worse. Well, how can they be much worse than what I already am suffering through? So if I've never had a job, what is this thing that you're saying that, jobs are going to be even more elusive? If I've never had a job, I do not really care what the exchange rate is today or tomorrow. So for me, these things are irrelevant. So when you over-intellectualize it, you actually alienate them even further. And the reality here is that we've seen the playbook play out in many different jurisdictions, where politicians feel that surely there must be a simpler answer to these very intractable and very intersectional economic questions. And the experiment and obviously the consequences are always very clear. So whether you look at Argentina, whether you look at Turkey in recent years, or even Zimbabwe much closer to the border, the reality here is that once you press that particular trigger, it becomes remarkably difficult to come back from it. And I think what is important is to be able to find a way of articulating that to many citizens as possible, that yes, it sounds attractive, it sounds like it's a shotgun solution to a long-term problem, but actually it isn't. Here's the evidence that indicates that it isn't. Now, do not then rely on the type of politicians that benefit from those anxieties to be ones that promote the message. So you're not going to hear it from the politicians warning against it. So the type of thing that Banyaza Lesufi promises people that he's going to do when he goes to an ANC meeting and says that I'm going to get all your ESCOM debts written off, he knows that it appeals to individuals because, well, who wouldn't want their debts being written off? But what is important is that so far we've been fortunate enough in that even within a very divided and a very diverse ANC, there are enough people who've actually read enough, who've actually seen enough to be able to say, well, actually, this comes with particular consequences. And if these consequences are the thing that, we all want to avoid, then let's not do them. And you've actually seen the ANC does have a series of internal guardrails, if you want to call it that. So if you remember the type of sentiments that emerged from the 2017 conference at Nasrec, look, if you left the conference and you looked at the entire range of resolutions, you'd have thought, if they do these things overnight, the country will be materially different 5 years down the line. They found a way to actually kill off their own resolutions, because I think once they get to the process of synthesizing the consequences, there are enough bureaucrats in the room who've seen enough, who've been there long enough to say, well, actually, guys, the consequence of this is X, Y, Z, and because we are responsible for the fate of the nation, these are the things that we cannot do. If I'm not in government, I'm not responsible for the fate of the nation, so I do not care what the consequences are. I do not have to care. The ANC, on the other hand, being responsible for actually then making sure things actually make sense and they balance, they kind of then say, actually, this doesn't make sense. And that's what they've been doing internally. Whether an ANC that then is forced into an alliance with someone else will have the same, ability to say, but even though this sounds attractive, it actually doesn't work. That's the litmus test that we have to face.
So does that mean no NHI?
Well, at 2 p.m., NHI will be the law of the country. It will be. And I think, obviously, what will then happen afterwards is a simple question of, well, how do you actually make it happen? And I think what happened in February in the budget speech when the minister pretended NHI doesn't exist, even though the bill was ready for signing, indicates that once you actually start asking them the questions of, okay, what is the cost of rollout? What are the implications and the practical features of this rollout? I think there'll be questions that are going to start anew, and you're probably going to see this taking much longer to actually start being implemented. I think, obviously, ideologically, everyone in the ANC will say ideologically we agree with it. But again, when you are in power, when you're in government, you kind of cannot distance your ideological orientation from the practical realization of what needs to be done, and that's where you're going to see it being paralyzed.
That's when you start wearing a suit, eh? Right now, Katlego, you know that the comrades are good, and they really want what's best for the country. People, you've got to watch that podcast, Citizens Concerned. Katlego Moahi, thank you for coming today. And let's turn it over to the people who are here. You've heard me enough. Do we have any questions that you'd like to put to the panel? Right, let's do this. I am the roving Mike.
Hi, I'd just like to ask the panel two questions. The one is, can we expect a cabinet shake-up after the elections? And the second question is, how do you perceive the rand in your different scenarios?
Prince?
Two more questions
Okay.
up, or
Well, let's take him. We'll get the next one now. We'll answer
Yeah, there
both
will
of them.
be cabinet shake-up. And that, so there will be a component of the current cabinet, a good 40% of the current cabinet. Those individuals will not come back. We know some of them who are old. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma will not be there, I can tell you. Pravin Gordhan will not be there. So those ones are easy. But remember, as we all said, there will be a coalition government. So that new partner will have people in that cabinet. So there will be a cabinet shake-up. It will depend on which partner is this. If it is the IFP, it will be very few ministers, less than 5 I would hazard. But if it is the DA, it will be slightly more. And there will be critical portfolios like finance that we have to watch, for example. So yes, there will be a cabinet shake-up. But the president, my view is that the president will still be Cyril Ramaphosa. He will not finish his term, definitely not. And the length of his term will also depend on how violently does the Paul Mashatile faction shake the tree. The rent, I leave it to the economists. But I'm young, relatively. But I remember buying a loaf of bread for less than 2 rand in my lifetime. Yes, I did. Actually, for less than, my earliest recollection was actually even less than 1 rand, a loaf of bread. I don't think those days will come back. They are gone forever. I see the rand declining further going forward. I don't know if there's a ceiling, but I don't think the rand will, in my lifetime, the rand will hit a good 30. In my lifetime, I think. I've seen it in my lifetime.
Unless
Yeah.
you're planning on departing this soon.
I've
I think
seen it.
Teddy's been very optimistic. Khaya, you watch these things closely.
behaving like Chris Hart. So the first question of the cabinet reshuffle, well, I think obviously the reality here is that even if the ANC wins, it's not an ANC that has 230 seats. It's an ANC that has much less than that in parliament. And also what is clear is that there's been a bit of a generational shift within the ANC in that some of the more older parliamentarians will be out. And so that's Nkosazana, Pravin Gordhan, for example, Lesetja Chenoli. We do not know if Naledi Pandor is coming back. And then there's also the reality that within the ANC itself, again, it has to balance multiple trade-offs. So the communists deserve a seat at the chair. So will Blade be the communist that emerges as the one who gets that seat? Or does the new Secretary General of the SACP believe now it's his right to sit in cabinet? So you have to look at those particular trade-offs. I think obviously it is of interest to see what happens to the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition versus the Ministry of Finance, because kind of feel that that's where a lot of the big decisions still need to be made. Ibrahim Patel is not high enough in the list to actually warrant a position. So that would mean that the president would have to find a way of keeping him in, which is a creative way. It's possible, but we do not know if he's going to bank enough capital on him to be the one that he allocates that seat to. So there'll definitely be a bit of a different cabinet. And of course, if there has to be an element of co-governance with someone else, if it's the IFP doesn't need, to be more accurate, they don't need a cabinet seat. They want the premiership of KZN. That's a very clear one. So give them that, and they're very chilled about everything else. But obviously, other parties not only would want cabinet seats, but nobody wants to be the Minister of Small Business Development because none of you know who that is and what they do for a living. So that's not what people are chasing. People want to be able to be in charge of the things that make a difference. And I think for me, the bigger problem, the bigger focus area after 29 May is what happens to the ANC resolution of December 2022 to essentially get rid of Pravin Gordhan. Well, he's decided to retire himself, but the whole idea was that that ministry must be dissolved and everybody must go back home to where they belong. So SAA must go to wherever, ESCOM must go wherever, and that's an important conversation because if the ministry stayed in its current orientation and I was in a big a king-making position, I would say, well, you're not going to give me the finance ministry, you're not going to give me the transport ministry, but I like the state enterprises portfolio because it has a lot of good, important assets. I mean, Transnet could be a standalone ministry in its own in other orientation. So that would be the type of thing I would beg on to say that I want that one. But if the ANC says, well, that no longer exists as a type of thing that one can control, then obviously you have to look elsewhere. But if, let's say, I was Julius Malema and you said I was in a king-making position and you say you're not going to give me the finance ministry because Prince thinks the rand is going to go to 30 rand, that's fine. I don't want that. I want that one, which is probably equally lucrative in some people's eyes. So that will be the type of thing we have to focus on. Does Cyril Ramaphosa actually implement that resolution? In other words, that ministry is dissolved, and if so, that has particular implications about who he then allocates to the portfolios that now control those key cabinet positions. On the question of the rand, I mean, the rand will be volatile, and I think we do not obviously know what the general trend in the short term might be, depending on what people think the government might or might not do. But I've been saying that, look, when the ANC had the open corridor to make things happen, it took them forever to do things. I don't know if things will be faster when they have to go govern with someone else. So perhaps we're stuck with what we have.
Bheki?
In terms of the cabinet question, I have nothing further to add amongst what my panelists have said. But I would say, in terms of the rand, I can have a hard call for you. I think we would see, in the short term, a stronger rand. And in that, you see that what's been going on over the past 2 weeks with the rand currently strengthening, and that's because of what's seen in the polling right now. The ANC is gaining momentum in the 45 percentiles, and it's coming close towards 50%. The country, in terms of its political stability, an ANC at close to 50% is much more of a certain outlook than an ANC polling at 40%, which raises the prospect of an ANC EFF coalition. So if we get a stable result in these elections and the basic functions of the government continue to run on, as what Khaya has clearly and eloquently laid out, if those continue to occur, you could see a stronger rand. And also what's happening now with global markets. South Africa, in terms of its monetary policy over the past 3 years, has been prudent. I don't think the South African Reserve Bank has been given its enough credit, with its interest rates being higher than that of the global world, which has been protecting the rand from massive devaluation given the political infighting that we're seeing amongst politicians, the low growth environment that the country has been on. Once you start to see, then there has been quite a lot of push towards rate cuts in the US. Once you start to see that in the global world, when rates begin to be cut, particularly in the US, particularly in Europe, as well as that of the UK, while South Africa's interest rates remain attractive, that's going to be rand positive. And speaking also on the fiscus, South African yields in terms of us actually fitting the bill, debt servicing costs have become the most expensive line item on the budget. But for an investor, South Africa's high yields, above 10%, compared to that of the global average, which has about single digits. So that's an attractive yield. And in an environment where rates are cut, you have risk-on sentiment, which moves towards emerging markets such as South Africa, such as that of our bonds, but also equities could also benefit from this with the cutting of interest rates in global markets. So I see a risk-on sentiment towards the end of the year in the short term, and a stable outlook would lead to a rand actually strengthening. In fact, I would say the rand, you would see the rand strengthen from its current levels and strengthen towards 17 in the short term. However, in the long term, the economic prospects with growth being capped at 2%, our fiscus, even though our government as a proportion, government expenditure as a proportion of GDP has not risen dramatically above revenue, another point which is often missed. In the budget that you saw in February, the National Treasury, including with the budget allocation of 1.4 million for the National Health Insurance, that's not the proper budget for the rollout of the National Health Insurance. They're telling that what you heard from the finance minister is that the National Treasury will not borrow to a large extent as revenue is tracking, as government expenditure is tracking revenue sideways. There's not a massive gap. Yes, we're running budget deficits. Yes, we're running budget deficits, but it's not to a high degree where we see double-digit budget deficits. So we're not borrowing a lot of money, and that's important because when countries borrow quite significantly, they often run to the printing presses. And the fact that South Africa is not printing a lot of money, that's positive for the rand in the short term. In the long term, as growth is capped at 2%, I think I agree with Prince, the rand will continue its gradual depreciation over the long term.
Right. Just we've got some people watching this live, and we've got some questions, and I'm going to take the second question first because I think you answered it in your presentation, Prince, and that is, why does the DA brand struggle to appeal to urban black voters?
Yeah,
They're not trying to, are they?
here's the thing. The DA is the runners of the experiment. You see, one of the, and they don't like this, and I tell them publicly. You see, the historic question for those who have been governing South Africa before the ANC was this: how do we as a minority control the majority in this country? That has been the English grappled with the same question. The Afrikaners grappled with the same question. And obviously, as they were grappling with this question, in that room when they were dealing with this, the majority was not there. Right? The DA is back in that boardroom, exactly in that boardroom. And the mistake that they have made is this: they don't have the majority in that boardroom. And therefore, that room is an echo chamber. They hear their own voices. And they are veering into the marsh. And by the way, they are now beginning to lose the future of South Africa. Because you see, Helen once made this presentation at this Agbi's, whatever it is, and said there are two colors that will either govern South Africa, red or blue, the EFF or the DA. That's why the DA declared the EFF its enemy number one, because they are contending their future. When they look at the future, they think either the EFF or us. But they've lost that battle for the future. Yeah. Why? It's because in that boardroom, there are no representatives of the majority. So this conversation, they are missing a big part of that conversation. And this idea that you're going to have one group, either white, governing South Africa alone, forget, it's not going to happen. Even the idea that we're going to have black people, by the way, in the boardroom, governing South Africa alone, it's not going to happen. You need both. So you need the best brains representing white people. You also need the best brains representing black people in the same boardroom and say, how do we govern this thing? Because, yeah. So the DA has missed that.
Yeah. I think a more pertinent question, I'm going to point this to our other panelists, and that is, what party should the entrepreneurial black middle class look towards in this election? Khaya, don't look away. I'm looking at you, sir.
Well, that's a tricky one. And I think when we look at the policy orientations of the different manifestos, we can obviously see the difference between the new parties that think that, look, the way the country's economic paralysis has been manifesting requires us to change the way in which we do things. And obviously there can be many ways in which they propose to do that. But I think what is also quite clear is that when you say the black entrepreneurial middle class, is that the economy still has enough bottlenecks and enough, deadlocks that makes it very difficult for black entrepreneurs to thrive and access spaces in the absence of state-led interventions. So in the absence of rules that said, well, actually within your procurement value chain, you need to be able to onboard black businesses, many businesses would get away without doing it. And why that matters is that we cannot be blind to the reality that left to its own devices, capitalism and South Africa's version of capitalism would probably not deal with some of the bigger policy issues that we want to be able to see about how do we migrate towards a more inclusive economic system. Now, obviously, I think the big mistake of what we've seen in the past 80 years is the focus may have been disproportionately on redistributing a small pie without actually focusing on growing the pie widely enough for any new entrants to seamlessly onboard into a rather inclusive system. I think that's been our great mistake, focusing on spreading the slices of the pizza much wider rather than actually getting a bigger dough. Oh, that sounds good, actually. They're getting a bigger dough and doing that over time. And I think, obviously, if anyone wants to be honest, if we're going to be fighting for the same pie, even those entrepreneurial black businesses are going to struggle. I think there aren't enough economic windfalls from what we have. So whichever party then proposes to grow the slice of the pie. Whichever party is willing to do the difficult and painful decisions that the ANC has avoided for too long in order to be able to grow the pie, then that's the party that you must follow.
And you don't see one?
No.
Bheki, do you see-
Look, I think the reason I don't see one is that a lot of parties at manifesto stage would probably hesitate to say the type of difficult trade-offs that are necessary to get us there. So when you talk about trade-offs, you have to be very clear to people that, well, the reason we've got a logistics crisis is because of the intersection of the management problem at Transnet and also the crime problem throughout the entire ecosystem, and also, you know, the intersectional issues that actually create that system. And that means that if I'm going to be in government and I want to fix the logistics crisis, this is what I need to do differently, this is how much it's going to cost, and this is how it must be funded. And obviously, at manifesto stage, you kind of sound like the type of person that is selling pain rather than Prince who's going to say, you're like a social grant, I'm going to double it overnight. So at that particular stage, these parties have to do the trade-off of say, well, if we say the things that nobody wants to say, do we actually then stand a chance of actually seeing those things see the light of day? And the view would be, well, actually, you said the type of things that everybody was scared to say. These people sold all the nice things. They told people that Christmas was going to be tomorrow, so therefore everybody went there. So what's the point of us having these wonderful ideas if we don't make it into the room where those ideas then have a possibility of being put to life? That's the problem that you see with manifesto. So I don't think any of these parties are unaware of the problem. Most of them simply do not want to confront it.
Prince?
Yeah, I hope and pray, by the way, that the black middle class, they call themselves entrepreneurial, I don't know about that they don't get the party that they want. I'll tell you why. This sounds controversial. The black middle class, over the past 30 years, actually, as a group, they have been getting the party that they want. The ANC, it has been giving them BE, affirmative action, right? That's what the ANC has been giving to the black middle class. And this has been a problem, by the way, because what it has done in the psychology of the black middle class, it has actually, it has made the black middle class feel a sense of entitlement and to get things easy. As a result, if you look at this group called the black middle class, they have actually not produced industries. Show me their industries, right? The Jews, they were poor at some point here in this country, right? They were on their own at some point. No, there's no government that look after them, but they created industries for themselves. So it is high time that this black middle class get nothing. When they get nothing, they will wake up. Yeah, they will wake up. Let me give you an example. This is controversial. Take me, for example, right? I have been persona non grata of the South African government for forever. I mean, everybody who knows my politics, I have been at it, fighting the ANC government, saying it's destroying my country. And I don't even know what a tender form looks like. I have survived. I'm building a chicken hatchery in Mpumalanga. I'm going there tomorrow, a chicken hatchery. Why? Because I know I get nothing from this government, so I have to do something for myself and my family. So the black middle class must get absolutely nothing so that they wake up, they start working and producing things. That will employ the poor black people. Poor black people in South Africa are not employed by the black middle class. The black middle class are actually recipients of social grants. It's just that their social grants are fatter. They are pampered by the ANC. They have been pampered by the ANC government. If you fired half of the black middle class in government, by the way, those fellows would be unemployable, most of them. What would they do? So they must not get anything. Thank you.
Bheki, we know that there is certainly one party that's talking about it, but they haven't featured on any of your polls. And that is somebody that Prince may know, and that's Action SA.
I wonder why Prince would know the guy that runs Action SA. I wonder why.
No, I wrote a book about it.
Coming to the
and
question,
I made a bit of money out of it. And I've been castigated for it. That's okay.
answering the question you've asked us, Mike, I tend to shy away from expressing my opinion and talking on the numbers and what the numbers show. But if you were to press me in terms of which political organization, which political party would be best for the black middle income class or black entrepreneurs, my honest view is that I have no faith in the caliber of leadership in the main parties. And that is a view that is also held by South Africans. If you look at when we pose the question, which type of coalition or which type of party do you have full confidence would improve your life. South Africans themselves are quite unsure. And it's because these officials are not telling a convincing story. They're not telling a story of actually growing the pie, of growing the South African economy, of growing fixed investment to the point where it is reversed where it currently is, sitting about 15% as a proportion of GDP, and going back to the same global average at 25%. I'm not seeing any party that's really discussing on those issues and also be quite brave in being controversial and standing front and center of those issues. I'm not seeing any party like that, but I will say this, I am encouraged with some of the rumblings that I'm seeing, particularly amongst the smaller parties, the ones that's not really sharing the dominant stage right now. Speaking of this, look at the political messaging of Build One South Africa. Look at the political messaging of other political parties. You can even, for all, however your views are, look at understand what is the colored vote in the Western Cape, as well as with the rise of the Patriotic Alliance. And I think it's because those main parties are not telling a convincing story, leading to that support to move away from them.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, I think is probably going to be a hard lesson or a hard message to top to end this particular event. We've been at this for a while, and to me, this has been the most important question. And we've got an esteemed panel, and nobody could give a convincing answer. And if you ask me, that is the absolute problem that we have in South Africa. Right? The country can only grow if we grow small business, and small business can only grow if there's a party in power that supports it. Not one party out there is saying unequivocally that they will support small business. I think there's a misunderstanding as to what support for small business is. I know that I've got my own strong view on that, and it's also a little bit controversial. It's not about money. It's about less red tape. The money, there's nowhere in the world that an entrepreneur walks into some bank and that walks out with a check. Doesn't happen. Right? All you want is the ability to open a business without interference. All you want is a state that doesn't load the dice in favor of the big companies. Instead, what we have is our big companies helping government, and then they get to write the legislation. And every single time that happens, they've done it again. That's why Eskom's working, because big business went to help out Eskom. What does that mean? That means that the small solar panel provider is going to be more, hard pressed to do that. And that company that helped them out, Martin Kingston and his mates, will get more tenders and more stuff. They'll get to write the legislation. And that's the problem in South Africa. And the fact that we can't point to one party that says we are pro-business and this is our plan. And it's not just about opening the cash vault. It's about making it easy to have small business. South Africa can never quite thrive. But in the meantime, we're heading towards elections. It's going to be a mess, but it's going to be interesting. I think what we've seen over here is that there is some reason for optimism, but there's still a long road ahead. So there's a good chance that today we help to clear things up and muddy it at the same time. So I'd like to thank everybody that took part in our panel. To Khaya, that got out of his sickbed to come here, thank you, Khaya. And Prince, Bheki, thank you for your presentations. To everybody that attended live and everybody that's here online, thank you so much. Please stay tuned to the State of the Nation. We'll keep on holding people to account. We'll keep on questioning their answers. It's not about asking the questions. So to everybody that joined us and enjoyed it, thank you so much, and we'll see you again on the State of the Nation. Thank you.
Lovely, man. That's great. That's great.
The ANC,
Thank you, sir.
My pleasure.